Some stories are written in blood and snow, but Fiona had never imagined her own would be, which made it rather fitting that she was about to spend every ounce of strength she possessed saving a dying beast, unknowingly binding her fate to a king's. They say the greatest acts of courage happen in the smallest moments. As it turned out, Fiona's moment of reckless compassion would shatter the walls around an alpha's frozen heart and remake Hecker into a queen. It begins in a blizzard so fierce that even the wolves stayed hidden in their dens. The wind screamed like a living thing as Fiona fought her way through the forest behind the castle walls. The bundle of kindling she'd gathered weighed almost nothing, but the cold made every movement feel like dragging stones. Her cream-colored dress, thin and worn from years of service, did nothing against the bite of winter. Madame Darla would be furious if she returned empty-handed. The head housekeeper had sent her out into the storm deliberately, of course. Punishment for some imagined slight, some flicker of defiance in Fiona's unusual blue eyes. Let the ghost girl freeze, Darla had probably thought, using that cruel nickname the other servants whispered behind her back. But Fiona had survived worse than Darla's malice. She would survive this too. The snow fell so thick now she could barely see 3 paces ahead. She needed to turn back, storm or not. But then, a sound cut through the howling wind. Deep, guttural, wrong. Fiona stopped, her white hair whipping across her face, blending with the snow until she was nearly invisible against the winter landscape. There it was again. A growl that dissolved into something that sounded almost like agony. She should run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee back to the castle, to safety. Whatever made that sound was dangerous. Predatory. But Fiona had been called a ghost so many times she'd started to believe the living owed nothing to the invisible. And yet, setting her kindling down, she pushed through the snowdrifts toward the sound, her legs burning with each step. 30 paces off the path, she found him. A massive white wolf lay crumpled beneath the skeletal branches of a frost-covered oak. Even collapsed in the snow, she could see the impossible size of him, easily as large as a war horse. His fur, pure white except where it was matted with crimson, rose and fell with labored breaths. Blood stained the snow around him in spreading pools of scarlet. "Oh gods," Fiona whispered, dropping to her knees beside the creature. His eyes cracked open. Not the yellow or amber she expected, but an unusual hazel green, bright even through the haze of pain. Those eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was dying. She could see it in the shallow rise of his chest, in the gashes torn across his side, claw marks for deep furrows that exposed muscle and bone. One of his legs twisted at an unnatural angle. Fiona looked up at the sky. The blizzard was intensifying, the temperature plummeting. In less than an hour, the storm would reach its full fury. She looked back at the wolf, at those hazel-green eyes that watched her with something that looked almost like recognition, like pleading. How had he gotten here? What had happened? The castle guards would never allow a predator this close to the walls. Unless, her breath caught, a shifter. He had to be a shifter. And if he was this injured, unable to shift back to human form, it meant he was dying. Fiona's hands trembled as she reached out, touching the blood-soaked fur. He was huge. Had to weigh twice what she did, maybe more. The distance back to shelter seemed impossible. She thought of Madame Darla's sneering face. Thought of the cold cellar room she called home. Thought of every person who'd called her worthless, invisible, a ghost haunting the castle halls. But this creature, this dying shifter, he'd looked at her like she was real. Like she mattered. The wind tore at her thin dress. Her fingertips were already going numb. "I can't do this," a voice whispered in her mind. "He's too heavy. The storm's too strong. I'll die trying." But Fiona had never learned how to abandon the helpless. It was her greatest weakness. Perhaps it would finally be her death. "I'm sorry," she gasped, working her arms beneath the massive wolf. "I'm so sorry, but I have to move you." She braced her legs, strong from years of carrying laundry and scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, and lifted. The wolf made a sound of pure agony. Her knees nearly buckled. The weight pressed down on her shoulders like an avalanche trying to bury her. But she thought of that look in his hazel green eyes, that silent plea, and somehow found the strength to take one step. Then another. The old woodshed she'd discovered weeks ago while hiding from Dala's wrath lay somewhere ahead, maybe 100 paces through the trees. It felt like 100 miles. One step, then another. The wind tore at her hair, sent her white curls whipping across her face like they were trying to blind her. Her legs screamed. Her shoulders burned. The wolf's blood ran warm against her back, soaking through her dress, the only heat in a world of killing cold. I can't, she thought as she stumbled, nearly fell. It's too far. I'm too weak. But the wolf's weight against her back felt oddly like an anchor. Like purpose. Like proof that she existed, that she could matter, even if only to this dying creature. Fiona gritted her teeth, tasted blood, and kept walking. The storm swallowed them both, two pale figures moving through endless white. A dying king and the ghost girl spending her last strength to save him. Neither of them knowing that this moment, this choice, would reshape the fate of a kingdom. Fiona's world had narrowed to three things: the weight crushing her shoulders, the cold trying to kill her, and the desperate need to keep moving forward. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Couldn't tell if she was still following the right direction or simply wandering deeper into the forest to die. The wolf's blood had soaked through her dress and frozen against her skin, turning the fabric stiff and heavy. Each gust of wind cut through the wet cloth like knives. 20 more steps, she told herself. Just 20 more. She made it 15 before her knee gave out. Fiona crashed into the snow, the wolf's weight driving her down. She tasted blood and ice, felt the world tilt sideways. For one blissful moment, she considered simply staying there, letting the cold take her. At least it would be quick. Then the wolf whimpered, a sound so broken, so utterly defeated, that it pierced through her exhaustion like a spike. No, Fiona gasped, spitting snow from her mouth. No, we're not dying here. She didn't know if she was talking to him or herself. Somehow, she got her arms back under him. Somehow, she stood. Her vision swam with black spots, but through them she caught a glimpse of weathered wood. The shed, barely visible through the curtain of white, listing dangerously to one side but still standing. 30 paces. Maybe 40. Fiona walked. The shed's door hung crooked on rusted hinges. She had to set the wolf down to wrench it open, and when she did, he made no sound at all. For one terrible moment, she thought he'd already died. Then she saw the faint rise of his ribs, the flutter of his eyelids. "Stay with me," she whispered, hauling him inside. The shed offered no warmth, but at least the wind couldn't reach them. A few rotting tools lay scattered in the corners, and old straw littered the floor, damp and moldy, but better than snow. Fiona dragged the wolf to the driest corner and collapsed beside him, her whole body shaking so violently she couldn't control it. They were going to freeze anyway. The thought arrived with crushing certainty. She'd saved him from dying alone in the snow, but they'd both die here in this miserable shed, and Madame Dala would probably be relieved to have the ghost girl gone for good. Fiona looked at the wolf sprawled beside her. His white fur was matted with blood and dirt, his breathing so shallow she had to watch carefully to see it at all. Even dying, there was something magnificent about him, something that spoke of power and dignity that transcended the brutality of his wounds. Without thinking, Fiona reached for her cloak. It was soaked through and frozen, useless as a source of warmth for her now anyway. But layered over his torn body, it might trap what little heat remained in him. Might give him a chance. She spread the cloak across his massive form as carefully as she could, her numb fingers fumbling with the fabric. The wolf's eyes cracked open, those strange hazel-green eyes that didn't belong to any wolf she'd ever heard of, and fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "You're going to be all right," Fiona whispered, though she had no reason to believe it. She pressed her hands against the worst of his wounds, feeling hot blood pulse against her frozen palms. Her cream dress was ruined beyond any hope of repair, stained so thoroughly with crimson that it looked like she'd been painted with it. Madame Dala would have her whipped for this. If she survived the night. When she survived the night. Fiona curled against the wolf's side, sharing what little warmth remained between them. His fur was damp but soft beneath her cheek, and she could feel his heartbeat, irregular and weak, but there. Still there. "We're going to survive this," she told him, told herself, told the darkness closing in around her vision. "Both of us. I didn't carry you this far to let you die now." The wolf made a sound, barely a breath, but it might have been agreement. Outside, the blizzard screamed its rage against the shed's thin walls. Inside, a ghost girl and a dying king held on to life with bleeding fingers, neither knowing that dawn would bring transformations neither could imagine. Fiona's eyes drifted closed. The last thing she felt was the wolf's breathing beginning to steady, to strengthen, as if her presence alone was enough to anchor him to life. Then the cold and exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into darkness. Fiona woke to silence. The blizzard had stopped. Pale dawn light filtered through gaps in the shed's warped walls, turning the air silver-gray. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why every muscle in her body screamed with pain. Then she felt the warmth beside her and remembered everything. The wolf. Fiona pushed herself upright, wincing as her frozen joints protested. The wolf lay exactly where she'd left him, her cloak still draped across his massive form. But his breathing had changed, deeper now, more regular. The wounds that had been bleeding freely last night had begun to close, the torn flesh knitting together with the supernatural speed of a shifter's healing. He was going to live. Relief hit her so hard it brought tears to her eyes. She'd done it. Against every impossible odd, she'd saved him. "Thank the gods," she whispered, reaching out to check the wound on his shoulder. Her fingers had barely brushed his fur when light exploded through the shed. Fiona threw her arm across her face, blinded. The air crackled with energy that made her hair stand on end, made her skin prickle with a power she couldn't name. Heat rolled off the wolf in waves, driving back the cold that had settled into her bones. When the light faded, the wolf was gone. In his place lay a man. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the shed wall, unable to look away. He was naked, sprawled across the straw where the wolf had been, and even wounded and unconscious, he was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and a warrior's build marked by scars that spoke of countless battles. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his face held a severity that didn't soften even in unconsciousness, all sharp angles and stern lines. But it was his eyes that held her frozen when they finally opened. Hazel green, the exact same shade she'd seen in the wolf's gaze. "You," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. Those eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, seen in a way she'd never been seen before. "You saved me." Fiona couldn't speak, couldn't move. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The size of him even in human form, the commanding presence that filled the small shed, the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. This was no ordinary soldier. No simple shifter returning from war. I found you in the snow," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "You were dying." "I was." He tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back with a pained grunt. The wounds were still there, angry red marks across his shoulder and ribs, though far less severe than they'd been in wolf form. Still might be. The poison. He touched his shoulder, wincing. "How long?" "All night. The storm just broke." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. He was studying her, she realized, with the careful attention of someone memorizing every detail. The curve of her cheek, the shape of her mouth. His gaze caught on her hair, white as the snow outside, falling in tangled waves around her shoulders, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or wonder. "Your hair," he said, "like winter itself." Fiona's hand moved self-consciously to touch the pale strands she'd always hated. "I know. It's strange. People say. It's remarkable." His voice was firmer now, carrying an authority that made her spine straighten instinctively. "You're remarkable. You carried me through a blizzard. Anyone would have done the same." No. The word was absolute. They wouldn't have. Most would have run. Should have run. His eyes darkened. "I was ambushed." The ones who did this, they might still be hunting me. You've put yourself in danger. You needed help. I did. Something in his expression softened, just fractionally. And you gave it, at great cost to yourself. His gaze traveled to her dress, still stiff with his dried blood, to her bare arms shaking with cold now that her cloak covered him. What's your name? Fiona. It came out barely above a whisper. Fiona. He repeated it like he was committing it to memory, tasting each syllable. He stopped, his jaw tightening. I am in your debt. He was hiding something. She could see it in the way he'd caught himself, in the careful control of his words. But he was also fading, his eyes struggling to stay focused, his breathing growing labored again. Rest, Fiona said gently. You need to heal. We can talk when you're stronger. Can't stay long. His words were slurring now. Not safe for you. His eyes locked on hers one last time, burning with an intensity that sent heat through her chest. Remember me, Fiona. I will find you again. Before she could respond, light flared once more. When it faded, the wolf was back, already slipping into unconscious sleep. Fiona sat in the grey morning light, staring at the creature she'd saved, her mind reeling. Those hazel eyes haunted her, along with the desperate promise in his voice. He would find her again. Somehow, that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. When Fiona woke again, the wolf was gone. Only her cloak remained, folded carefully in the corner where he'd lain, and a set of massive paw prints leading out into the fresh snow. She stared at those tracks until her eyes burned, trying to convince herself she hadn't imagined it all. The transformation, the man, those hazel eyes that had looked at her like she mattered. But her dress was still stained with his blood. That, at least, was real. The sun had climbed higher, turning the world outside into blinding white. Fiona's stomach twisted as she realized how long she'd been gone. The firewood she was supposed to gather. The duties she'd abandoned. Madame Dala would be waiting. Her legs barely held her as she stood. Every step back through the forest was agony, her body protesting after the night's ordeal. The castle loomed ahead, its grey stone towers stark against the pale sky, and with each step closer, the dread in her chest grew heavier. She slipped through the servants' entrance, hoping to reach her quarters unnoticed. If she could just change her dress, wash the blood away, maybe. Well. Fiona froze. The voice sliced through the kitchen corridor like a blade. Madame Dala stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, her sharp features arranged into an expression of cold fury. She was a handsome woman in her way, dark hair pulled back severely, keen eyes that missed nothing, a mouth made for cruelty. The other servants called her beautiful. Fiona had only ever seen her as dangerous. Madam, I can explain. Can you? Dala descended the stairs with deliberate slowness, each step echoing in the sudden silence. The other servants had vanished like smoke, leaving Fiona alone to face her wrath. You were sent for firewood yesterday afternoon. Simple task. Even for someone as useless as you. Her eyes traveled down Fiona's ruined dress, and something flickered in her expression, disgust mixed with satisfaction. Instead, you return a full day later, dressed like a butcher's whore. There was a storm. And every other servant made it back safely. Dala circled her slowly, a predator examining prey. But not you. Not the ghost girl who thinks she's special because of her freakish hair. She stopped in front of Fiona, close enough that Fiona could smell the lavender water she wore. Tell me, what were you really doing out there? Rolling in the snow with some village boy? Spreading your legs in exchange for shelter? Heat flooded Fiona's face. No, I would never. Don't lie to me. Dala's hand shot out and grabbed Fiona's chin, forcing her head up. Her grip was iron. I've watched you for 3 years, you strange little creature. Watched you sneak away when you think no one's looking. Watched you moon about like you're too good for honest work. She released Fiona with a shove. I won't tolerate a whore in my household. I'm not. Fiona's voice broke. Someone was hurt. I helped them. That's all. Someone. Darla's laugh was razor-sharp. How convenient that you can't name them. How convenient that you return wearing another's blood like a badge of honor. She stepped back, her expression settling into something cold and final. You violated your duties. Destroyed castle property. She gestured at the dress. And you dare stand before me without even the decency to show remorse. Madam, please. The laundry cellar. 3 days. No food. Water only. Darla snapped her fingers, and 2 footmen appeared from the shadows. Perhaps hunger will teach you the value of obedience. 3 days? But I haven't done anything wrong. You existed. Darla's smile was vicious. That's wrong enough. The footman grabbed Fiona's arms. She didn't resist. There was no point, but her mind was reeling. 3 days in the cellar. It was barely more than a hole in the ground, damp and freezing, where they soaked the linens before washing. No light, no warmth, just stone and darkness and cold. They dragged her down, down through the castle's depths, past the kitchens and storerooms, into the bowels where the air smelled of mildew and despair. The cellar door was heavy oak reinforced with iron, and when they threw her inside and slammed it shut, the darkness was absolute. Fiona collapsed against the wet stone floor, her body finally giving out. She was so tired, so cold. The brief hope she'd felt watching the wolf, the man, recover had been crushed beneath Darla's heel like it had never existed. He'd promised to find her again. But he didn't even know who she was. Not really. Didn't know she was just a servant, easily punished, easily broken. By the time she got out of here, if she survived 3 days in this pit, he'd have forgotten all about the ghost girl with white hair. Above her, she heard footsteps, voices, life continuing as if she'd never existed at all. Fiona wrapped her arms around herself and tried not to cry. She'd saved a life last night, spent every ounce of strength she possessed to drag a dying creature to safety. And this was her reward. Darkness, cold, cruelty, the same things she'd known all her life. King Kyle had been gone from his castle for 3 weeks, hunting the traitors who'd ambushed him in his own forest. 3 weeks of tracking, of blood and vengeance, until every conspirator lay dead in the snow. He'd returned to his throne expecting rest. Instead, he'd found himself unable to focus on anything but the memory of white hair and blue eyes, and the girl who'd carried him through a blizzard when she could barely stand. Fiona. Her name had been the only warmth in his fever dreams as he healed. He stood now in his private chambers, dressed in the formal black and silver that marked his station, while his steward rattled off reports about the castle's management in his absence. Kyle heard none of it. His senses were stretched through the castle, searching for one particular scent, winter frost and wild roses, that had been burned into his memory. Sire. The steward paused. Shall I continue? The staff, Kyle said abruptly. Assemble them. All of them. In the great hall. Now. My lord, it's mid-morning. The servants are in the middle of. Now. The word carried enough alpha command that the steward actually stumbled backward. Yes, sire. At once. 20 minutes later, Kyle stood on the dais overlooking the great hall, watching servants file in with nervous confusion. Maids and footmen, cooks and stable hands, all of them whispering behind their hands, wondering what had possessed their king to summon them like this. Kyle's eyes swept over every face, searching. His wolf prowled beneath his skin, agitated and demanding. She was here. She had to be here. This was the nearest castle to where she'd found him, and she'd mentioned returning to face punishment. But he couldn't find her. A tall woman with severe features stepped forward from the crowd and dropped into a curtsy. Your Majesty, welcome home. I am Madame Darla, head housekeeper. The staff is assembled as you commanded, save for a few who are. Kyle's nostrils flared. Her scent hit him like a physical blow, harsh lavender water barely masking something rotten underneath. And beneath it, threaded through like blood in water, was another scent. The punishment order. He could smell the satisfaction on her, the cruelty, the same vicious pleasure predators took in tormenting weaker prey. "Where is she?" His voice came out as a growl. Darla blinked, her composure slipping just fractionally. "Sire." The girl with white hair. Kyle descended from the dais, his movements deliberate, controlled. Every instinct screamed at him to shift, to let his wolf tear the truth from this woman's throat. "Where is she?" The hall had gone deathly silent. Darla's face had lost color. There is a servant with such coloring, Your Majesty, but she's currently indisposed. She's in the cellar." Kyle didn't know how he knew, but suddenly the knowledge was absolute. That faint scent he'd been tracking, barely perceptible beneath the castle's usual smells of stone and fire, it was coming from below. Far below. "You put her in the cellar." "The girl violated her duties, my lord. She disappeared for an entire day and returned in a state of 2 days ago." The timeline clicked into place with sickening clarity. The same night he'd stumbled into the castle through the servant's entrance, still weak, still partially shifted. The same morning he'd left before dawn to avoid being seen, to protect her from the danger that followed him. "She saved my life 2 days ago, and you locked her in the cellar." The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Darla's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Kyle didn't wait for an answer. He was already moving, striding through the crowd of servants who scrambled out of his way. He knew the castle's layout by heart, could have navigated it blind, and his wolf led him unerringly downward. The laundry cellar door was locked. Kyle ripped it off its hinges with his bare hands. The smell hit him first, cold, damp, and beneath it the scent of sickness and fear. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and his heart stopped. She was curled in the corner, her white hair plastered to her face, her skin so pale it was almost translucent. The cream dress was still stained with his blood, now mixed with filth from the cellar floor. She didn't move when light flooded in, didn't even seem to register his presence. "Fiona." Her name came out broken. Kyle crossed the distance between them and dropped to his knees, gathering her carefully into his arms. She was freezing. Too light. 2 days without food, in this cold, after she'd already exhausted herself saving him. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed. "Am I dreaming?" "No." He stood, cradling her against his chest. "You're not dreaming, and you're never going back in here. I swear it." He carried her up through the castle, past the servants still assembled in the hall, past Madame Darla whose face had gone the color of ash. Let them see. Let them all see their king carrying a servant like she was made of spun glass and starlight. Let them see who truly mattered in this kingdom. Behind him, he heard Darla start to speak. Kyle turned, his eyes flashing gold, the wolf rising to the surface. "You," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "are dismissed. Pack your things. You have until sunset to leave this castle, or I will have you thrown in that cellar for 3 days. See how you like the accommodations." Then he turned his back on her stunned silence and carried Fiona toward his chambers, toward warmth and light and safety, toward the beginning of everything that mattered. Fiona woke in silk sheets that smelled of pine and winter nights. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was still dreaming. The fever dreams that had plagued her in the cellar, where warm hands lifted her and a rough voice promised she was safe. But the softness beneath her was real, and so was the fire crackling in the hearth, filling the room with golden light. She sat up slowly, her body aching but no longer screaming. Someone had bathed her, dressed her in a clean nightgown of fine linen, and left a tray of food on the bedside table. Bread with butter, roasted chicken, fresh fruit that must have cost a fortune in winter. "You're awake." Fiona's head snapped toward the voice. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the afternoon light, and even without seeing his face clearly, she knew those shoulders, that commanding presence. The man from the woodshed. The wolf she'd saved. "You're the king," she whispered. Not a question. The truth had been settling over her in pieces, the way servants had scattered before him, the authority in his voice, the royal chambers she'd woken in. "Kyle." He moved closer, and she could see his face now. Those hazel eyes. My name is Kyle. Your Majesty. Kyle, he repeated firmly. You saved my life, Fiona. You carried me through a blizzard when you could barely stand. You don't bow to me. But the distance between them felt vast anyway. He was a king. She was a servant who'd spent 2 days in a cellar. The silk sheets beneath her felt wrong, too fine for someone like her to touch. I should go, Fiona said, starting to rise. I shouldn't be here. In your chambers. People will talk. You're staying. Kyle's voice carried that alpha command that made her spine straighten instinctively. The physician says you need 3 more days of rest at minimum. You'll stay here where I can ensure you're properly cared for. But the other servants will say nothing, unless they want to join Madame Dala in exile. He paused. When you've recovered, you'll be assigned as my personal attendant. The position comes with private quarters, higher wages, and my protection. No one will dare touch you again. The offer should have filled her with relief. Instead, anxiety coiled in her chest. Why? Because you saved my life. That's not a reason to upend the castle hierarchy. Fiona forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm nobody. A ghost girl with strange hair who scrubs floors. Making me your personal attendant will cause talk. Resentment. It's not appropriate. Something flickered across Kyle's face. Do I look like I care about appropriate? Over the next 3 days, Fiona learned that King Kyle cared very little for convention. He visited her every morning and evening, bringing books from his private library when she confessed she could read. He sat by her bedside and told her stories about the war, about the kingdom, about everything except the ambush that had nearly killed him. And when she was finally strong enough to stand, he insisted she begin her new duties immediately. The scars, he said, gesturing to his shoulder. They still ache. The physician says massage will help the healing. So Fiona found herself in the king's chambers each evening, her hands working over the scarred flesh where teeth and claws had torn into him. The wounds had healed into raised white lines that marred his otherwise perfect skin, a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to death. Does it hurt? She asked softly, her fingers tracing the largest scar. Not when you touch me. His voice was rough. Nothing hurts when you touch me. Fiona's hands stilled. The air between them had grown heavy with something she didn't dare name. She was acutely aware of how close they were, of the heat radiating from his skin, of the way his breathing had changed. Fiona. Kyle caught her wrist gently, stopping her from pulling away. Look at me. She did, and the intensity in his hazel eyes stole her breath. I want to court you, he said. Properly. The way you deserve. The words hung between them like crystals, beautiful and fragile. Fiona's heart lurched with longing so sharp it was almost pain. You can't, she whispered. Why not? Because I'm a servant. Because everyone will say I seduced you, used your gratitude to climb above my station. Her voice cracked. Because a king cannot court a ghost girl without destroying his own reputation. They'll call you mad. Say I've bewitched you. And she pulled her hand free, stepping back. I won't let you ruin yourself for me. Fiona. No. She moved toward the door, her chest tight with tears she refused to shed. I'll tend your scars because that's my duty. But I can't, we can't, she couldn't finish. Couldn't voice the impossible want that had taken root in her chest. Kyle stood, and for a moment she thought he would command her to stay. But his voice, when it came, was gentle. I'm not giving up on this. On us. Fiona fled before she could do something foolish, like believe him. Behind the closed door, she pressed her hand to her mouth and tried to remember how to breathe. She could still feel the warmth of his skin under her palms, still see the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. But precious things and ghost girls didn't belong in the same world, no matter how much she wished they could. Fiona headed to her new quarters, small but private, with an actual window, when she'd heard voices drifting from the linen closet. She should have kept walking, should have minded her business the way a smart servant would. But one of the voices was Dala's, and the other made her blood run cold. "The king grows more infatuated by the day," Darla hissed. "He cancelled a meeting with the northern lords to take tea with that white-haired witch. He's making himself look like a lovesick fool." "Then perhaps," said a man's voice, smooth as poisoned honey, "it's time we reminded him what happens to kings who forget their duty." Fiona pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. She knew that voice. Duke Lucian. He'd visited the castle twice since the king's return, always with platitudes about loyalty and service. Kyle had seemed wary of him, she remembered, though he'd never said why. "The girl is the problem," Darla continued. "Remove her, and the king will return to himself. He'll see reason. See that a proper match with my niece Ophelia would strengthen his position." "Your niece?" Lucian's laugh was sharp. "You mean strengthen your position? How long have you been feeding information to the Eastern rebels? Darla? 2 years? 3? Fiona's breath stopped. "A spy. Madame Darla was a spy." "Careful, Lucian. I've fed you information as well. If I fall, you fall with me." Darla's voice dropped lower. "The ambush 3 weeks ago was perfect. Should have killed him, if that wretched girl hadn't interfered. But she did, and now she's wormed her way into his bed." "Not his bed. Not yet. But it's only a matter of time." Fabric rustled, Darla pacing, Fiona imagined. "We need to remove her permanently. Discredit her so thoroughly that the king will have no choice but to cast her out. Or execute her," Lucian added thoughtfully. "That would send a clearer message." Silence stretched between them, heavy with dark intention. When Darla spoke again, her voice carried the satisfaction of a spider watching prey struggle in her web. "The Alpha Mother's jewels. The sapphire collection she left to Kyle when she died. They're kept in the royal vault, but I still have access from my years as head housekeeper." Darla's voice turned calculating. What if those jewels were discovered in the ghost girl's possession? The penalty for stealing royal heirlooms is death. "Too obvious," Lucian said. "The king would suspect." "The king is blinded by infatuation. He won't suspect until it's too late." Darla's voice hardened with certainty. "We do this during the winter solstice ball, when the castle is full of visiting nobles and witnesses. When the king cannot simply wave away evidence without looking like a tyrant protecting his mistress. And while he's dealing with that scandal, you'll have your opportunity. Without the girl to distract him, without his wolf senses sharp, he'll be vulnerable." Darla paused. "The same poison as before. One scratch is all it takes. By the time anyone realizes, it will be too late to save him." Fiona's vision swam. They were planning to kill Kyle, to frame her and murder him, and she was the only one who knew. She had to tell someone, had to warn him. But even as the thought formed, doubt crept in. Who would believe her? A servant barely elevated above her station, accusing a duke and the former head housekeeper of treason? Kyle would believe her. He had to. Fiona turned to flee and her shoulder brushed the wall. A decorative sconce rattled. The voices inside the closet stopped. What was that? Fiona ran. She didn't think, didn't plan, just fled through the servant corridors like a deer before wolves. Behind her, she heard the closet door slam open, heard Darla's sharp intake of breath. She made it to her quarters and locked the door with shaking hands, her mind racing. She had to tell Kyle tonight, before Darla could act. Before. A knock at her door made her jump. "Fiona." It was Olva, the kitchen maid who'd become her only friend in the castle. "There's a message from the king. He's been called to the eastern border. An emergency with the lords there. He left an hour ago." No, that couldn't be. "He'll be back before the solstice ball," Olva continued through the door. 5 days. He said to tell you he's sorry for leaving without saying goodbye. The ball was in 5 days. Fiona sank onto her bed, her whole body trembling. Kyle was gone, likely walking into a trap. And she was here, alone, with enemies closing in like winter wolves. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hide watchers. When she finally did drift off near dawn, she dreamed of hazel eyes and blood in the snow, and woke to find guards standing at her door. Fiona of the servant quarters, one said formally, "You are summoned for questioning regarding a theft from the royal vault." Her mattress had been pulled apart, and there, gleaming against the white sheets like drops of frozen blood, lay the Queen Mother's sapphires. The spider's web had closed around her, and the king was too far away to hear her scream. The dungeon was nothing like the laundry cellar. It was colder, darker, and it smelled of old blood and despair. Fiona sat on the stone bench that served as her bed, iron shackles heavy around her wrists. They hadn't been necessary, where would she run? But the captain of the guard had insisted. Evidence of the crime, he'd called them. The sapphires that had gleamed so damningly from her mattress. She tried to explain. Tried to tell them about Darla, about Lucian, about the conspiracy she'd overheard. But her words had sounded exactly like what they were. The desperate lies of a servant caught stealing. "The king will believe me," she'd said, clinging to that certainty like a lifeline. "When he returns." "The king," the captain had replied coldly, "is bound by the same laws as any man. Even he cannot dismiss evidence of treason." 3 days she'd been here. 3 days of cold and silence and the growing certainty that she was going to die. The sound of boots on stone made her look up. For one desperate moment, she thought it might be Kyle, returned early, come to save her again. Instead, Duke Lucian appeared beyond the bars. He was handsome in the way predators were handsome, all sharp angles and careful grace. His smile never reached his eyes. "The little thief," he said pleasantly. "I thought I'd come see how you were settling in." Fiona said nothing. Couldn't trust her voice not to break. "It's a shame, really." Lucian stepped closer to the bars. "The king was so fond of you. But even his affection has limits. Stealing from his dead mother? That's unforgivable." "I didn't steal anything." The words came out hoarse. "You know I didn't. You and Darla." "Careful." His voice turned sharp as a blade. "Making wild accusations will only make your trial shorter. The penalty for theft is bad enough. Add slander of noble blood, and they'll have your head on a spike before sunset." He was right. She knew he was right. But the words clawed at her throat anyway, demanding to be spoken. "You're going to kill him. At the solstice ball. You're going to kill Kyle." Lucian's smile widened. "Am I? How dramatic." He leaned against the bars, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath. "Let's say, hypothetically, that were true. Who would you tell? You're locked in a dungeon. The king is occupied with preparations for the most important diplomatic event of the year. And even if you screamed your accusations from the rooftops, who would listen to a confessed thief?" Fiona's hands clenched into fists, the shackles biting into her wrists. "He'll see through your plan. Kyle isn't stupid. Kyle is distracted. By you, ironically enough." Lucian straightened. "He's fighting the council right now, demanding they release you. Embarrassing himself before every noble house in the kingdom, all for a servant who betrayed his trust." He shook his head with mock sympathy. "You've already destroyed him, little ghost. We're just finishing what you started." Then he was gone, his laughter echoing down the stone corridor. Fiona pressed her face against her knees and tried not to shatter. Above her, in the council chamber, Kyle was losing his mind. "The law is clear, Your Majesty." Lord Chancellor Brennan's voice was infuriatingly calm. "Theft of royal property demands a trial. Your personal feelings cannot override." "My personal feelings?" Kyle's hands slammed against the table hard enough to crack the wood. His wolf surged beneath his skin, golden eyes flickering. "She saved my life. She carried me through a blizzard when she could barely walk. And you expect me to believe she'd steal from me?" The evidence was found in her quarters. Brennan gestured to the sapphires laid out on black velvet. "There's no question of her guilt. Someone planted them." Kyle's voice was almost a growl now. "Someone is trying to frame her." "Who? And why?" Duke Lucian spread his hands reasonably. Forgive me, sire, but who would bother framing a common maid? If someone wanted her gone, there are easier methods. Kyle's eyes snapped to Lucian, and for a moment something cold and knowing passed between them. But before Kyle could speak, another lord cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the northern delegation arrives tomorrow. The eastern lords are already here, along with representatives from the coastal provinces. The solstice ball is in 2 days. Lord Brennan's tone gentled slightly. The entire kingdom is watching. If you simply dismiss this evidence without trial, it will look like you're above the law. Like you're willing to corrupt justice for a personal indulgence. The words hit like a physical blow. Kyle knew they were right, knew that his reputation, his ability to rule, depended on being seen as just and fair. But Fiona was rotting in his dungeon for a crime she didn't commit, and every instinct screamed at him to tear the castle apart until he found the real culprit. She'll have her trial after the solstice, Kyle said finally, the words tasting like ash. And I will personally oversee it. Until then, she remains in custody. A wise decision, sire. But it didn't feel wise. It felt like betrayal. That night, Kyle stood outside Fiona's cell, separated from her by iron bars and the weight of a crown he'd never asked for. She was curled on the stone bench, her white hair dull in the torchlight. When she looked up and saw him, something broke in her expression. I didn't do it, she whispered. Kyle, you have to believe me. I do. He wrapped his hands around the bars, wishing he could rip them apart. I know you didn't. But the council won't release you without a trial, and I can't, his voice cracked. I can't dismiss the evidence without destroying everything I've built. The kingdom would tear itself apart. I know. Her voice was so small. I understand. 2 more days. After the solstice, I'll hold the trial myself. I'll find who did this. They're going to kill you. The words burst from her like blood from a wound. At the ball. Darla and Lucian. They're planning to poison you. That's why they did this, to get me out of the way so I couldn't warn you. Kyle went very still. Tell me everything. The solstice ball had already begun when Ulva appeared at Fiona's cell, breathless and terrified. I'm so sorry I couldn't come sooner, the kitchen maid whispered, her hands shaking as she worked a thin piece of wire into the lock. They've had me running since dawn. The feast, the preparations. I only just got away. Ulva, you shouldn't be here. Fiona pressed herself against the bars, her heart hammering. If they catch you, then they catch me. The lock clicked. Ulva pulled the cell door open, her round face set with determination. You saved that wolf in the blizzard. Everyone knows it was you, even if we're not supposed to say. You're not a thief, and I'm not letting you rot down here while, she swallowed hard. While they do whatever they're planning. Fiona grabbed her friend's hands. What have you heard? Whispers. Duke Lucian's brought his own guards. Too many of them. And Madame Darla's been seen in the servants' passages near the ballroom, even though she's supposed to be exiled. Ulva's voice dropped. Something's happening tonight, Fiona. Something bad. I can feel it. The shackles came off next, the iron clattering to the stone floor. Fiona's wrists were raw and bleeding where the metal had bitten into her skin, but she barely felt it. Kyle had believed her warning about the assassination, but what if that wasn't enough? What if Lucian had changed his plans? Or Darla had found another way? What if she was already too late? The ballroom, Fiona said, already moving. I have to get to the ballroom. You can't go like that. Ulva gestured at Fiona's filthy dress, her matted hair, the grime coating her skin after 4 days in the dungeon. You'll be stopped before you reach the stairs. I don't care. She ran. Through the dungeon corridors, up the winding servant stairs, her bare feet slapping against cold stone. Guards shouted behind her, but she didn't stop, didn't slow. Every second mattered. Every heartbeat brought Kyle closer to danger. The castle was transformed for the solstice. Evergreen garlands draped every banister, candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, and the sound of music and laughter drifted through the halls like something from a dream. Fiona crashed through it all like a ghost returned from the grave. Filthy, desperate, wrong. A footman tried to grab her. She dodged past him. A lady in silk gasped and pressed herself against the wall as Fiona sprinted by, leaving dirty footprints on marble that had been polished to a mirror shine. The ballroom doors stood open, revealing a scene of impossible splendor. Ladies in gowns that cost more than Fiona would earn in a lifetime. Lords in velvet and jewels. The walls draped in silver and white, the floor polished to gleaming, and at the center of it all, Kyle. He stood surrounded by nobles, dressed in formal black with the silver crown of his station catching the candlelight. He looked every inch the Alpha King, powerful and commanding, and so impossibly far above her station that Fiona's breath caught in her throat. Then his eyes found hers across the ballroom, and the entire world stopped. She saw the shock cross his face, the relief, the fear. His lips formed her name, though she couldn't hear it over the music. Fiona started forward, and that's when she saw him. Duke Lucian, moving through the crowd with a wine glass in one hand, moving toward Kyle with purposeful grace, and in his other hand, concealed by the drape of his sleeve, the glint of a blade. No! Fiona's scream cut through the music like a knife. Every head in the ballroom turned. The musicians stopped mid-note. Time seemed to slow as hundreds of eyes fixed on her, the filthy servant girl in her prison rags, standing in the doorway of the most important social event of the year. She saw Madame Dala in the shadows along the wall, her face going white. Saw Lucian freeze, his hand tightening on the concealed dagger. Saw Kyle start to move toward her. It's him. Fiona pointed at Lucian with a shaking hand. He has a weapon. He's going to. Lucian moved. Not toward Kyle now, but toward her. Fast, inhumanly fast, the blade flashing as it came free from his sleeve. His face had transformed from pleasant nobility into something feral and desperate. If he couldn't kill the king, he'd kill the witness. Fiona had spent her life being invisible, being overlooked, being the ghost girl no one saw. But in that moment, with the poisoned blade slashing toward her heart and Kyle's anguished shout echoing through the ballroom, she had never been more seen. She dove sideways, felt the blade whisper past her ribs, hit the marble floor hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Lucian loomed over her, raising the dagger for another strike, his face twisted with fury. Then Kyle was there. The sound he made wasn't human. It was the roar of a wolf, of an alpha whose mate was threatened, and the raw power of it shook the chandeliers. He hit Lucian like a force of nature, and they went down in a tangle of claws and rage. Because Kyle wasn't fully human anymore. Golden eyes blazed in his face, fangs had extended past his lips, and his hands had become something between human and wolf as he tore the dagger from Lucian's grip and sent it skittering across the ballroom floor. The poisoned blade stopped at Madame Dala's feet. She stared at it. Then at Fiona, sprawled on the floor, meeting her eyes with absolute certainty. Guards! Fiona's voice rang out, stronger than she'd known it could be. Arrest her. She's part of the conspiracy. Dala ran. She made it 3 steps before Kyle's guards, the ones loyal to him, not to Lucian, caught her arms and drove her to her knees. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Fiona pushed herself upright, her body screaming in protest. Around her, nobles scattered like startled birds, their elegant gowns and fine suits flashing past in a blur of panicked color. But she couldn't look away from where Kyle had Lucian pinned to the marble floor. The Duke was still fighting, still trying to shift fully, but Kyle's hand was wrapped around his throat with crushing force. The Alpha King's face was terrifying, half human, half wolf, golden eyes blazing with a fury that promised death. You tried to kill her, Kyle snarled, and his voice carried such command that every person in the ballroom froze. You framed her, imprisoned her, and then you dared to raise a blade in her presence. She's nothing. Lucian choked out, defiant even while dying. A servant. You're destroying your kingdom for a... Kyle's claws pierced deeper. She is everything. Movement caught Fiona's eye. Madame Dala, still held by the guards, had gone very still. But her eyes were fixed on something across the ballroom, a figure in servant's clothing slipping toward the side entrance. Another conspirator, trying to escape. They! Fiona pointed, her voice cutting through the chaos. Stop him! Guards moved instantly. The figure broke into a run but didn't make it 5 steps before he was tackled. When they hauled him upright, Fiona recognized him, one of Lucian's personal attendants, probably meant to finish the job if the Duke failed. Kyle's eyes met hers across the ballroom. In them, she saw the question. Are there more? Fiona scanned the crowd, her heart pounding. Her gaze landed on a cluster of Eastern lords near the refreshment table, and something about their positioning felt wrong. Too ready to flee. Too aware of the exits. The Eastern delegation, she called out. Don't let them leave. For a moment, she thought Kyle might question her, but he simply nodded to his guards, who moved to block the doors. 3 of the Eastern lords immediately tried to push through, confirming their guilt. The conspiracy was larger than she'd known. Larger than even Kyle had suspected. Secure them all, Kyle commanded, his voice still carrying that otherworldly alpha resonance. Anyone who moves for the exits. We'll sort the innocent from the guilty, but no one leaves until we do. Then his eyes found Lucian again, and something cold and final settled over his features. You orchestrated my ambush in the forest. You plotted to murder me in my own hall. And you tried to kill the woman I love. The words sent a shock through Fiona's chest. The woman I love. The penalty for treason is death, Kyle continued, and his claws flexed against Lucian's throat. But the penalty for threatening my mate is something far worse. You die knowing you failed. That your conspiracy crumbled. That the ghost girl you tried to erase will rise higher than you ever stood. Lucian tried to speak, but Kyle didn't give him the chance. With one sharp movement, it was over. The Duke's body went limp. Kyle stood slowly, his form beginning to shift back to fully human, though his eyes still burned gold. He looked every inch the Predator King, standing over his kill with blood on his hands, and the ballroom had gone deathly silent. Then he turned and looked at Fiona. The world narrowed to just the 2 of them. Kyle crossed the blood-stained marble, nobles parting before him like water, until he stood in front of where she still knelt on the floor. He dropped to his knees beside her, reaching out to cup her face with hands still bearing claws that were slowly retracting. You came, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You escaped and you ran straight into danger to save me. Of course I did. Fiona's hands came up to cover his, not caring about the blood, the claws, the hundreds of witnesses watching. You saved me first. In the blizzard. In the cellar. Every day since. Fiona. His thumb brushed across her cheek, and she realized she was crying. I told the council you were everything. I meant it. You are everything to me. My salvation. My conscience. The only warmth in a world of cold stone and colder duty. He took her bleeding wrists gently, examining the wounds left by the shackles, and something broke in his expression. I am so sorry, he whispered. Sorry I couldn't protect you from this. Sorry you suffered because of what you mean to me. I'd suffer it again, Fiona said fiercely. 1,000 times. If it meant keeping you alive. Kyle's eyes closed briefly, as if her words caused him physical pain. When they opened again, they were blazing with determination. He reached up and removed the silver crown from his head. The ballroom, already silent, somehow became quieter. I am Kyle, Alpha King of this realm, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. And I claim this woman as my mate. My Luna. My queen. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone, probably one of the more traditional lords, made a sound of protest. Kyle's head snapped toward them, his eyes flashing gold in warning. Anyone who objects may challenge me for the right. Here. Now. I will fight every last one of you. No one moved. No one dared. Kyle turned back to Fiona, and his expression softened into something so tender it made her chest ache. I have nothing to offer you but a kingdom that nearly destroyed you. A crown that will bring you as much pain as joy. Enemies who will spend their lives trying to tear you down. He took her hand, pressing it over his heart. But I also offer you this, my devotion, my protection, every breath in my body and every beat of this heart. I am yours, Fiona of the white hair and impossible courage. I have been yours since you spent your last strength to save a dying wolf in the snow. Tears streamed down Fiona's face, but she was smiling. I'm still a ghost girl. No. Kyle lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her scarred wrist. You're a queen. My queen. The ghost girl died in that blizzard. What rose in her place is something far more powerful. He held out the crown to her, silver gleaming in the candlelight, and his eyes asked the question his lips didn't form. Fiona looked at it. At him. At the ballroom full of nobles who'd spent her whole life looking through her as if she didn't exist. They were all watching now. All seeing her. She thought about the woodshed, the cellar, the dungeon, every cold, dark place she'd survived. And she thought about hazel eyes in the snow, and a promise that someone would find her again. He had. And he'd brought her not just safety, but a kingdom. Yes, Fiona whispered. Then louder, her voice ringing clear, yes, I accept. Kyle's face transformed with joy so pure it took her breath away. He lifted the crown and placed it gently on her head, his hands lingering in her white hair. All hail, he said, rising and pulling her up with him, Queen Fiona. Luna of the realm. Savior of the king. The woman who taught me that true strength isn't measured in claws and crowns, but in the willingness to bleed for another. The guards were the first to kneel. Then the servants, including Ulva, tears streaming down her face as she smiled. Slowly, reluctantly, the nobles followed. An entire ballroom, kneeling before the ghost girl. Fiona stood in her prison rags, wearing a crown of silver, blood staining the marble at her feet, and felt the weight of it settle over her. Not just the crown. The responsibility. The power. The knowledge that she would spend the rest of her life proving she deserved this. But when Kyle pulled her into his arms, held her like she was precious beyond measure, and whispered thank you for saving me against her hair, she knew she'd already proven it. She'd spent her last strength carrying a dying king through a blizzard. And in doing so, she'd saved not just his life, but her own.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you'll surely enjoy the next one. Subscribe and hit the notification button. Your hopeless romantic, Amora.